Hi, good afternoon. My name is Daniel Hayden. I'm president of Restore America's Estuaries. Welcome today to our first in our series of webinars and workshops for the Inclusive Coast Initiative. We're really happy to have you here today. Before we start jumping into the content here, I do want to make you aware of the upcoming summit that's occurring in New Orleans this December. We've put out a call for proposals, so if you're interested in presenting, check out the website. The URL is right there. And if you have any questions on it, please reach out to us and we're happy to discuss the summit format with you to make sure we have as a robust set of presentations as possible. Brianna, if we could go to the next slide, please. Before we jump into the content of today's presentation, I do want to acknowledge the hard work, the team that put together this presentation. Philip McAdoo, who's our Inclusive Coast Senior Advisor, Brianna Yancey, who did the bulk of the work in putting together these slides, and also Nicole Elkis, who's the project lead on this. And I also thank the ongoing support of the National Science Foundation for funding this work. We very much appreciate everything going into this and ongoing support of everyone and our panelists today who helped make this presentation possible. So with that, I'll hand it over to Philip to start today's session.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and welcome everyone to our Inclusive Coast Initiative, Improving Equity in Grant Making. We are so excited to bring the first in a series of workshops to you, and we're looking forward to spending time with you today. Next slide, please. So our agenda, we're going to start with some introductions, then do an ICI overview, talk a little bit about DEIJ and grant making, funding in DEIJ, Q&A, and then our wrap up. Our objectives are to introduce participants to the Inclusive Coast Initiative, discuss the inherent connections between DEIJ and grant making, and learn about funding barriers, needs, and strategies in relation to DEIJ. Next slide, please. Introductions. We're so excited to see all of you here. So if you would take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat, start with your name, your location or organization, and think about what you're hoping to learn from the Equity and Grant Making webinar today. What are some of the things that you're curious about, excited about? What are you really hoping to get out of our time together? So we'll allow time for folks to put their responses in the chat. I'm always excited to hear what people are interested in learning, because it helps to inform the way we think about and structure these conversations moving forward. What are some of the things you're hoping to learn from our time today? How to make our grant programs better on the DEIJ front. Thank you. That's great. New ideas from other nonprofits. Yes. Outreach and advertisement of RFPs and to be more inclusive. Thank you so much, Sarah. How to advertise grant opportunities to a wider audience. Nice. Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, keep sharing in the chat. These will be really important, and hopefully we'll touch on those. And if not, we'll go back and look at some of the things you all highlighted and use it to inform our work as we move forward. Helping BIPOC-led organizations get access to environmental grants. Great. So as those continues to populate, next slide, please. I'm going to go over some just expectations in terms of how we're spending our time together. These are our shared agreements. Be curious, open, and respectful. Practice self-care and take the time that you need. You know, oftentimes people get Zoom fatigue. So if you need to be off camera, that's totally fine. No one knows everything. Together, we know a lot. So think of this as a collaborative experience and conversation. Take space, make space. I say this to my son all the time, who loves to chat. Like, honey, make sure that you're listening to other folks as well. Speak from your own experience. That's often framed as speak from the I perspective. Challenge assumptions. Be conscious of intent versus impact. Dismantling systems of oppressions benefits everyone. Opposing systems of oppression, building alternatives, and cultural change are all necessary parts of our work. So just be mindful of those as we continue with our time today. If people feel like there's something that we're missing, you can add that in the chat as well, and we'll be mindful of it as we move throughout our time today. Great. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Daniel, who's going to give you more of an overview. Daniel? Great. We still have some people who are interested in engaging broader populations in our programming to be more inclusive. Thank you, Stephanie.
All right, Philip, thanks for that introduction. And thank you very much for the comments that have come up. It gives great context for what people are interested in and how we can focus the work. If you go to the next slide,
excuse me, this is Miss Margaret Gordon. I'm kind of late sending in my comment.
That's okay. Where's your comment, Miss Margaret?
My comment is, why is it the ocean-based
organizations aren't addressed maritime business impact? Yes, that's great. So we'll pick that up later in our discussion, but thank you for sharing that.
Great. Restore America's Estuaries is a national organization representing 10 different coastal and based conservation organizations. And we serve as a national voice on policy issues and a convener on major issues. And one of the issues that, of course, has come up is the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're excited to bring together this series of webinars. If you could go to the next slide, please. Just wanted to highlight that when our board of directors updated our strategy in 2019, there were 3 core pillars for us to focus on. And one of those pillars was to engage a broader and more inclusive community. So this is clearly a very important thing from the board perspective, that we continue to develop expertise and expand the knowledge base and level of engagement on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've listed some of the things that RAE has been doing as an organization to advance the issue since the strategic plan was launched in 2019. And I don't put this out there so much as sort of a self-congratulatory, but rather to sort of give some indication that all of us can do some things immediately to make progress on this pathway towards a more inclusive coast. And so hopefully from this list and the ideas that are brought forward today and in future workshops, we can build this out and show that there's concrete things we can do to make progress. So if you go on to the next slide, please. So as many of you know, RAE is an administrator of a number of different grant programs for both the federal government, state and regional authorities, and the corporate sector. So we're quite familiar with the administration of public-oriented funds. And what we've seen here is that over time, the benefits of coastal restoration and our investments in our coastal communities are not shared equally. And that so much of the benefits of the investment have gone to certain types of community, and we've left out many communities, and the negative development that happens along our coast and coastal communities typically adversely affect the same type of disadvantage in most vulnerable communities. And this is clearly something that has to change. So we looked at this and our contribution to the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion from the perspective of how can we improve funding mechanisms for coastal restoration, and trying to hypothesize a bit of what are some of the funder issues, and then what are some of the implementer issues, so that people are actually doing the work on the ground. You know, from the funder side, oftentimes we've seen that their goals are not tied to the communities in which these projects are occurring. They may have match requirements that less developed organizations, less established organizations can't meet. They have complex reporting requirements that are also a barrier to getting grants. They use very difficult legal language, and they're relying on their current network of implementers to actually implement the projects rather than reaching out to new audiences. So those are some of the things we've seen on the funder side. On the implementer side, that is the organizations and the communities doing the work, what we've seen is a couple of different things, and we want to explore this further, of course, with all of you. is that there tends to be an over outreach to their existing stakeholders rather than investing in finding new stakeholders and new constituencies who can benefit from coastal restoration. Oftentimes, they just don't have the networks from these communities and don't necessarily have the funding or the time or the perceived time to build these networks. Also, a barrier has been that the projects may prescribe things that are limited in scope and benefits, so sort of very specific areas, and systematically exclude communities who haven't historically benefited from coastal restoration projects. And then frankly, for a lot of the organizations, they do have the intent to expand the stakeholders that they're engaged with, but just don't know where to begin. So those are some of the initial thoughts we have of where RAE can play a role as a convener to match some of the funder issues with implementer issues and begin to address how coastal restoration is funded and implemented throughout our country. So with that background, I'll hand it back over to Philip to lead the next set of the presentations.
Thank you, Daniel. Next slide, please. Now, a big part of us working together has been gathering a group of thought partners to help us outline the program and the impact of the work that we'll do together. And so this was done by gathering a working group that will be long-term partners who set the stage for lasting change and guide the agenda of workshops for grant makers and diverse implementers. And you'll see here the list of folks who are represented in our working group. The National Association of Conservation Districts, Old Women Creek, Ohio Department of Natural Resources, NOAA, EarthJustice, PEW, Green Youth Foundation, WCS, University of Puerto Rico. It's been really great to have such thoughtful and engaging individuals really helping us shape these conversations and think about long-term solutions to the questions that we're trying to answer. Next slide, please. Now, the working group will develop a series of workshops. And so as you can see from this next slide that we'll start with our grant makers workshop and an implementers workshop. From there, we'll take best practices and talk about a collaborative sharing, and we'll continue to refine and to share this process out and looking at the ways that we promote our findings, thinking about what are some of the questions that we are trying to answer, what are the problems that we're solving for, and how do we build long-term solutions that really impact equity in the grant making process. Next slide, please. Now, here are some of the things that we have been able to complete today. The ICI Grant Makers Workshop Series. Number one will be an Inclusive Coast Initiatives Improving Equity in Grant Making. That's what we're doing today. It'll be an ICI overview of DEIJ and grant making. Also a funding and DEIJ history. Looking ahead to number two will be an Inclusive Coast Initiative, rethinking our application process, internal cultural and DEIJ, solutions to barriers through applications. And our last workshop will be Inclusive Coast Initiative Partners, Communities, and Program Design. Solutions to barriers in program design, outreach, and deliverables, liberating structures, 15% solutions. So these are some of the ways that we're thinking about structuring these conversations with the goal of answering some of the questions and things that you were curious about that you shared in the chat earlier. Next slide, please. DEI and grant making. DEIJ and grant making. That's been, next slide, please. One of the things that we've been thinking about is why DEIJ? And if we go back to what does DEIJ mean in our next slide, we'll see here in the Oceans Foundation that diversity is the spectrum of people's identities, cultures, experiences, belief systems, and viewpoints. Equity is equal access to power and resources while identifying and eliminating barriers that could prevent access to participating and contributing. Inclusion is respecting and ensuring that all relevant experiences, communities, histories, and people are a part of communications, plans, and solutions. And justice, the principle that all people are entitled to equal protection of their environment and entitled to participate in and lead on decision-making about environmental laws, regulations, and policies, and that all people should be empowered to create better environmental outcomes for their communities. Now, there are a wide range of the ways that people are looking and thinking about DEIJ. And so for the purpose of our workshops, we're using the definitions from the Oceans Foundation, knowing that there are many different ways that people are thinking about DEIJ. There are many different ways that people are thinking about environmental justice. So we wanted to be really thoughtful in naming those 4 components today. Next slide, please. And so why DEIJ? I think that's been a question that several of us have been wrestling with over the couple of years. What is the importance of diversity? What is the importance of equity? What is the importance of inclusion and justice as we think about this framework? And what's happened is that for a number of years, we've been really focused on diversity, making sure that there are different perspectives, different kinds of people, different ways of thinking about this work. And we recently started to see a lot of literature, a lot of language grounded on equity. What's the equitable way to provide access? You know, how are we making sure that we're looking at things through an equitable lens? And I think I'll come back to inclusion, but the justice piece of it is making sure that through diversity, through equity, that people have an opportunity to improve communities, to improve environments, and so that justice overall prevails. And I think the one thing that we are all thinking about in a really thoughtful way is this notion of inclusion. What does it mean to create inclusive practices? What does it mean to do this work in a really thoughtful way where we're centering communities, where we're centering people, where we're centering the environment, and those things are really important. And so this is where this is the phase in our work where we really are thinking about how all these things connect and what it means from every aspect of an organization, particularly in grant making, when we're thinking about access, when we're thinking about opportunity, we're thinking about the long-term impact that it will have on communities. Next slide, please. Now, here are a few examples of the literature that has really helped to guide our thinking and ground us in this initiative. Funding Indigenous People looks at how funders collaborate with and bring support to Indigenous communities around the world. Justice Outside Liberating Paths works to create a more just and sustainable outdoor and environmental movement. The Liberated Paths grant-making program aims to shift resources to and build power with Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. In Deep, Closing the Gap seeks to expedite closing the gap in funding so that BIPOC-led organizations work on climate change and the environmental movement are equally supported as white-led climate organizations. All investors will be welcome and invited to participate in a learning journey to explore co-creation of an equitable funding environment in climate change. Environmental Justice and Philanthropy, a landscape assessment on the misalignment between the EJ and the philanthropic sectors, and to find areas of opportunities to build greater alignment over time. The State of Diversity in Environmental Organizations. This is the most comprehensive report on diversity in the environmental movement. It surveyed 191 environmental nonprofits, 74 government environmental agencies, and 28 leading environmental grant-making foundations to investigate their gender and racial diversity composition. There are also readings and videos available from these resources. And we encourage you to really take the time to explore these wonderful opportunities to continue to engage in this work in a really depth and detailed way. Next slide, please. There's 2.7 billion funding gap between white-led orgs and BIPOC orgs. Next, here's some of the high points we wanted to share with you. A majority of environmental funders were not only predominantly white, with less than 12% consisting of persons of color, but the dominant culture of the organization is alienating to the ethnic minorities, the poor, the LGBT community, and others outside the mainstream. This is from 2014 from the State of Diversity in Environmental Organizations. Another interesting fact, the 12 Nations Foundation in this study awarded a total of $1.34 billion of environmental grant making dollars to environmental organizations, and about 1.3%, roughly 18 million of that was awarded to EIJ organizations. This is from Building Equity and Alignment Initiative of 2020, so relatively new data. And finally, the biggest threat to the viability of the EIJ movement is a general underfunding of the movement and the procedural constraints that make it difficult for grassroots groups to engage with funders. This is from the Environmental Justice and Philanthropy Challenges and Opportunities for Alignment, Gulf South and Midwest Case Studies of 2020. So lots of great things for us to think about as we continue centering these conversations and working through some of these challenges. Next slide, please. So here's a summary of findings from these resources. I mean, there are lots of things for us to look at, but if you look at the overlying issues, solutions, and framework tools, some of the issues identified were connections, building rapport, securing support, sustainable relationships. How do we really build in those relationships? Discrimination, extractive nature coming in and taking things away, lack of accessibility, marginalization, and land rights. When we think about some of the solutions that we've identified or that come out of these resources, relationships driven and trust, how do we build trust? Multi-year grants, again, access to funds, long-term capacity building, networking opportunities, offer continuous support before, during, and after grant period, streamline application and reporting processes, expand proposal criteria to include unconventional projects, and giving through an intermediary. And here's some frameworks and tools that we can kind of use and share amongst ourselves and through our networks. Community-centered frameworks, indigenous-led philanthropy, directing funds especially to go towards EJ, BIPOC, and underserved groups, Jiminy's principles of democracy, participatory grant making, and applying social equity lens. Lots of great things in these resources, so continue to take advantage of those. Next slide, please. So we did a survey in response to the work that we were doing. So we wanted to get a sense of what was happening. And so, as we mentioned earlier, where we learned about people's hopes, we also learned about barriers when it came to making grants more equitable. This is a non-scientific pulse check of how people perceive barriers in progress in the DEIJ issues. These surveys results have provided some indication of where we need to focus, but should not be considered fully representative or replicable. Our ICI surveys results connect to what we read in the resources on this topic. Most people indicated barriers that involve having enough capacity or not having enough funding to address DEIJ work, grant complications, and barriers with access. And we'll address some of those in our next two workshops, but as you can see there, capacity, funding, staff, lack of understanding about DEIJ access. These were some of the things that were informing the work that we're doing today with you. Next slide, please. And so we also learned about successes when it came to making grants more equitable. As you can see there, DEIJ has become a huge priority of organizations' leadership. That's 81.82%. Overall increase in staff understanding about DEIJ and its importance and how it applies to conservation work. Funding, we'll start to see a little drop there, but at 45% progress in funding, access, and DEIJ is now a priority of the organization's board. Again, lots of work to do, but there is some progress around capacity, fundraising, and grant complications. Next slide, please. So applying a DEIJ lens to grants. Who's a part of your org or your review team? Who are your partners? Who are you serving? There are some things to consider. Where are your stakeholders? Where are your efforts focused? And what? What is your intent and your impact? And what kinds of projects are you funding? Well, those are some really important questions to ask yourself: who, the where, the what. And it's our hope today with our guests that we'll begin to create some understanding and to answer some of those big questions. It's simply like, where do we start? You know, what are some of the things that we can do right now? Next slide, please. So we're really excited to talk about funding and DEIJ and the barriers and the needs and the strategies with our panel today. Next slide. I want to thank you all. I know there was a lot of information that we shared with you, but there's a lot of detail that went into making sure that we were setting this up in a really, really thoughtful way. And we're so excited to hear from people who are on the front lines of this work and the work that they're doing in our panel. So I'm proud to introduce you to Ms. Margaret Gordon, co-director of West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, Kirin Kumar, Deputy Director of Equity and Government Transformation, Carolina Strategic Growth Council. Susan Park, Executive Director in Coastal and Estuarine Research Federation. So everyone, please join me in welcoming our panel. Welcome, everyone. I'll give folks time to turn on their cameras.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Ms. Margaret. How are you?
I'm here.
Here, we're so glad you're here. Thank you so much. I guess, Ms. Margaret, we will start with you. If you can tell us a little bit about your work and the overview, and then we'll go to Kirin and Susan.
I'm a native of the Bay Area. I live in West Oakland, and a community where our shoreline is totally dominated by a port, the Port of Oakland, and it has been constantly expanding over the last 25 years. And with my organization, I am one of the founders and the co-director of the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, which is a community-based environmental justice group that targets air, water, and soil issues, especially public health implications from diesel particulates, toxic soils, and water intrusions from soil. We also base our work on community participatory research. So we do all our work is always targeted by having the research and the data. And we train and organize residents in West Oakland this methodology. And our science and energy is really spent on most recently about knowing what is the impacts regarding air, water, and soil, block by block, and very hyper local details of the impact from the diesel particulates, black carbon, NO, CO, all those different things, how it has impacted the residents' life and ability to have the ability to have solace in their life without having a truck parked on your block, truck traffic daily, and then have the cumulative impacts of the trucks, the trains, the ships, cargo handling equipment, all coming through this one particular community. And also we have 3 freeways surrounding one neighborhood. So that's who we are. And we as organization have stressed the process through the city, through the county, and with the port to change its behavior, such as creating a truck route that the truckers do not have to come into the community for services. Also for a truck route that keeps them from coming through the neighborhood as they come in and out the port. Develop plans and processes to achieve electric trucks and charging stations out of the neighborhood. Documenting how many trucks that have come through the neighborhood at any given time. We have done a truck survey and trained other communities that have trucks coming through it, how to do the same thing. And we have been able to take these things to agencies. And also we have organized agency working groups so that we as residents, or we as an organization, have to go to each one of the agencies that deal with air, water, and soil to be in one room. And most recently in California, there was this thing that has been passed called AB 617, which has given communities like West Oakland the opportunity to develop action plans for emission reduction. So that's what we are.
Great. And Ms. Margaret, I want to give you an opportunity because I see in the DEIJ discussion, you asked why not health? Can you talk about the importance of including health in these focus?
Okay, because based on my conditions of West Oakland, we do have parks in the port area, but it's right up next to the operation. So we constantly breathing in particulates from the diesel, from the trucks, from the ships, from the trains, and from the cargo handling equipment. So that's why earlier in my question, where's the issue about maritime and their responsibility and around resort this organization talking about them and how they impact the ability to be healthy in neighborhoods when we have a facility like a port. And that was not very clear. It was not very clearly stated to me what I could see. So the health piece is that we have high levels of asthma, cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease in one neighborhood. That we know that 1 out of 5 children between the ages of 0 and 5, ages between infancy and 5, end up in the emergency hospital because of respiratory problems. And we do know we have a high level through our work to be done with EDF, that cardiovascular disease is rising very highly within this community. And most of those who get the cardiovascular disease are all African Americans. So that's why health is important. And then also living in the urban core, we got to have some places where we have serenity. And it's not having serenity if we have a park and a port area where there's constant 24 hours of operation.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Ms. Margaret. Thank you for that context. Kirin, it's a nice transition to you. I see you shaking your head. You introduce yourself, and maybe if there's something you want to riff off of that Ms. Margaret shared.
Yeah, at the same time, I don't even know if you all need to hear from me. Ms. Margaret is doing such incredible work in West Oakland, and I think is a wealth of knowledge around how funding and funders can really start prioritizing community-led work like they are doing down there. And so I'm just honored to join you all today and this amazing panel to kind of share a little bit more about what we are doing at the statewide level in California. And so just quickly, I'm Kirin Kumar. I'm SGC's Deputy Director of Equity and Government Transformation. And my background is, before joining the state system, is in kind of community-based organization work and transportation justice, actually working on quite a few of the things that Ms. Margaret just mentioned around disproportionate exposure to pollution in our communities of color. But in that space, I had really worked to shift our organization's mission away from transportation for the sake of transportation to transportation for the sake of access to opportunity, wealth, health, and well-being. And in doing so, really shifting the work looking at systems change, where it wasn't just kind of planners at the city deciding what transportation investments needed to happen in our communities, and instead really bringing community to the forefront of actually decision making in what has otherwise been a very top-down process that has led to disproportionate impacts around health and access to opportunity. But in doing that work, what I kind of call capacity building work, it was very clear to me that it was very difficult and very underfunded work. And so when an opportunity came up at the statewide level to kind of expand that reach statewide and really actually invest in that kind of work for the first time, I jumped at the opportunity. And so I'm now at the California Strategic Growth Council, which is a cabinet level organization within the governor's office of planning and research. And I often joke that or I guess it's not even a joke, it's the truth. We're the carrot side of the carrot and stick model. And so we're known for re-granting either cap and trade dollars or other dollars to communities to really implement community-led climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience projects. And so, we are known for some of our larger affordable housing and sustainable communities programs, some of our climate change research project that really centers community-led research. But, it kind of an under-recognized part of our portfolio is recognizing that not all communities in California have the same access to resources and funding. And, we know that communities that are successful in accessing dollars to do these big transformative projects often have the ability to hire grant writers, have strong collaborative networks in place, have philanthropic support. And so the work that kind of some of my teams are doing is really working to address those disparities in funding and access to resources through some of our capacity building work. And so I can get into that a little bit more as we talk today, but again, just so honored to be invited to chat with you all today.
Thank you so much, Kirin. Looking forward to hearing more about the community-centered, community-led research and the capacity building. Susan, please.
Thanks, Philip. And I just want to echo what Kirin's saying. I'm really honored to have been invited to this panel and to be with these fantastic panelists. I'm going to take it in a little bit of a different direction. Again, my name is Susan Park. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the executive director of the Coastal and Estuarine Research Federation, or CERF. I'm based in Richmond, Virginia, and I've been with CERF since 2016. I come with a little bit of a different background. I'm an oceanographer by training, and I've worked at different organizations that are sort of at the intersection of coastal science, policy, and management. So CERF is not your traditional grant-funded organization. We're a membership organization, and our members are coastal and estuarine scientists and managers from all different sectors: academia, nonprofit, for-profit, government. We have a lot of student and early career members, and that's something that we really emphasize. We really focus on supporting their growth and professional development. And our main activities, we support a biennial conference and we publish a scholarly journal. So financially, we're largely supported by member dues, by journal royalties, by revenues from our conference. But that really doesn't give us a lot of wiggle room to support other high priority activities like DEIJ. We're also a very small organization. I am actually the only employee, although we do have some contractors that help with the logistics. And so that means that our activities are very volunteer driven. So we depend on our volunteers to get things done. And one of the things I was really excited about when I joined CERF was that the organization has really prioritized EIJ efforts, building a more inclusive and diverse federation, and by extension, a more inclusive and diverse discipline is one of the 5 priorities that's listed in our current strategic plan. And our efforts are led by what we call the Broadening Participation Council, under the umbrella name of Rising Tides, or Toward an Inclusive, Diverse, and Enriched Society. And this has been one of our more popular, active, and probably outcome-driven committees. So this is something that's a real high priority for us. And, we already have that expertise and emphasis that I mentioned to support the next generation of coastal and estuarine scientists. So diversifying the workforce, it just, to be more representative of the coastal communities that we work in, it just was a logical place for us to put our efforts. But as previously mentioned, there really hasn't been a lot of, there's no internal funding really to be able to support this. So we've gone out to seek a lot of outside funding, particularly for these workforce development activities. And the main program that we have is called the Rising Tides Conference Program, or RTCP. This program brings in students from groups underrepresented in the marine sciences to our biennial conference. And we define underrepresented very broadly, sexual orientation, gender identity, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, physical ability, you name it, et cetera, et cetera. I can't miss this opportunity. Brianna was one of our Rising Tide scholars in the last round, and she's just fantastic. And Ray and CERF are just so lucky to have her. So, the goal of the RTCP is to increase a sense of belonging of, students that are underrepresented in coastal and estuarine sciences, so that we can hope that they see themselves in this career and will persist in this career path, thus diversifying CERF and those science and those fields. So we bring them to the CERF conference, we provide all the financial support, but we provide them with mentors, both professional and near peer mentors. We provide professional development opportunities. We really want them to connect with others in their cohort, develop a peer support network, and hoping that this will help them see themselves in this career long term. And we're also trying to infuse these concepts within the conference. For example, we funded and supported an implicit bias workshop at the conference so that we could spread this information more broadly to the other attendees. And we really could not do this without the generous support of the National Science Foundation and more recently the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So CERF has learned a lot about grant funding in the past several years. And in addition, you might call us a grant making organization as well, because the students that participate in the RTCP are applying to the program. And so we're also constantly thinking of how we can be more inclusive and equitable in that process as well. And I will stop there.
That's great. Thank you, Susan. And thank you all for such a rich overview of the work that you do. And this is your professional identity, which is really impressive. And I'm curious to know, and we'll start with you, Ms. Margaret, what about your personal experience that informs your approach to this work? Susan talked about having the opportunity for students to see themselves reflected in this work, but what about you all in terms of your personal experience that really helps inform the way that you approach this work? Ms. Margaret, we'll start with you.
Okay, well, I came to this work under crisis right after the 1989 freeway. And they were in the process of restructuring, rerouting, and of the freeway, and the impact, the previous impact of having a freeway right down the middle of a community, and what that meant about rerouting this freeway, and simultaneously while we were having these emergency meetings about rerouting the freeway and where trucks were going to be going, and simultaneously trying to understand what that meant for West Oakland. And then while they were doing some construction work for the rebuilding of it, the workers were overcome by vinyl chloride in the groundwater. So that's how we really got more involved around my organization was just at the beginning of trying to strategize around the issue of rerouting the freeway, dealing with trucks, understanding the port, understanding the health impacts of West Oakland. So I call it that we always been chasing the emergencies issues that are happening around air, water, and soil in West Oakland. Not until we were able to start asking questions to a research organization called the Pacific Institute. And they had the EIJ department where we were able to come up with a strategy to how to address these emergencies. And also, as we were simultaneously doing all these other things and working with this group called Pacific Institute, we decided, there was a decision made that let's start measuring stuff. Measuring all these impacts of West Oakland. So we narrowed down from 250 things and organized a community working group down to 17 things, which we developed community knowledge of change. And that's how we start grounding ourselves. And this publication came out in 2002, and we're updating it right now. But if we had not had the ability to ask the questions, ask those primary questions as community members to a research team and use that as a base for our work, we would not be here today and been as successful as we have been, and re-educating, retooling ourselves, and having that ability to be able to converse about the research. So as for the day, as we have been moving forward, when we start talking about these grants, the grants to me are placed in a disparity process, because the income level for California, especially the Bay Area, is not the same as what's happening in Virginia. If I want a very professional academia, graduate, master's students to work with me in this community, $50,000 is not enough. I got to have a grant. Grant has to be dispersed. These grants are not dispersed equitably based on the economics per community. And this is not the first time I said this. So grant making, and whoever is the grant manager, do not have a vision of that. I have not had a training or have that skill set to understand. Every community have a different form of which how to do the work is completely not the same. So one of my problems about grant making is that they don't look at that. For me here in West Oakland, for me to keep a person, we have to raise almost $75,000 as a salary and a benefit to an individual. But the grant making don't see that complications for Northern California or for Oakland, San Francisco. There has to be some balance of equity here of who the organization is, where the geographics are, what is the economic issues of that community. For many of these grants is not being addressed.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ms. Margaret. Hope you all taking notes. He's dropping some wisdom, this wisdom. And Kirin, this kind of goes into what you talked about in terms of your community-led research. Can you share more about what that looks like, kind of picking up what Ms. Margaret talked about?
Excuse me, one more thing. And also we do citizen science, community-led research too. We were one of the first ones who really put that out there over 15, 20 years ago. So
Yeah,
Sorry
yeah.
about that.
Thank you. No, that's okay. No, it's really great. And Kirin, just thinking about your approach, can you share some of that, but also piggyback on when we talk about community-led research? What does that mean?
Yeah, 100%. Two things I just want to underscore in what Miss Margaret just shared. One, research is power, and it's often a hidden form of power that we don't think about. Working at the statewide level, I am just struck by how much research is directly informing policy and then funding. And for us to be funding research that does not also include community at the outset is creating an unjust system from the beginning, right? Because that research may be producing outcomes that are not either relevant to, respective of the community context, or really counter to where that community is going and what it needs. And so I think a call to action that we've already gotten the first 10 minutes of this panel is that research has to include and fund community from the outset because of the impact that research has on then driving funding and policy work. The other thing that I want to really underscore that Ms. Margaret said is that there are structural barriers to the grants that we make available to communities. The most well-intentioned grants with a 10% overhead rate is not going to cut it for community organizations. I don't know who it was 25 years ago that decided the way that we value and judge the efficacy of a nonprofit is based on the limited amount of overhead and indirect costs that they use, right? It's like it's a way of looking at the investment of dollars from an efficiency standpoint, not a sustainability standpoint, right? We can't be hiring staff who are going to have to find a new job in 6 months just because our funder wanted us to find that or to come to an outcome. And so the more that we as funders can look at things as specific as our indirect cost rates and our overhead cost rates, creates more accessibility to our programs. And so I just wanted to underscore those two pieces. And then in terms of, the California Strategic Growth Council and our climate change research program, as far as I am aware, we are the only program, at least at the statewide level in California, that funds research that actually requires our research institutions to include community organizations as part of their scopes of work. It's not just that we're funding a higher share to community engagement after the research is done and we're just kind of shopping out what we found. It's that community is part of the scoping of the research. Community is part of identifying what kinds of outcomes we want to see with that research, the tools that are going to actually help move policy and systems change work at the local level. That is a shift in the way of thinking around research that I think needs to happen across all of our fields because of kind of what I shared earlier, the implications of research, how it actually drives policy decisions. So maybe I'll stop there unless you'd like me to share a little bit more about kind of my personal background, but I think we're getting into it, so I'm happy to just get into it.
Yeah. I know you all are getting into it, and that's great. And Susan, anything that comes up for you when you think about your approach and how maybe your identity has informed that? But I really like the way you kind of set us up with this whole notion of having young people see themselves reflected in this work.
Yeah, that certainly was a big influence on me. I really started to notice it when I was in graduate school, and didn't see a lot of peers that looked like me, and certainly didn't see any role models. There were very few women faculty, very few Asian American faculty, and I believe zero at that intersection. So I felt that, and I felt that for my other, the other students of color that were in my program, it was somewhat isolating. And I carried that through the various positions that I've been in. There were a lot of places where I was putting together volunteer reviewers or working groups or advisory boards or recruiting students for fellowships. And I really tried to keep that in mind as I was recruiting those folks. But there was more of an awareness rather than like a practical action. And so that's what I've really loved about coming to CERF. There is acknowledgement that there are, evidence-based ways to recruit and retain diverse folks in STEM, in the science field in general, and in marine sciences, which is one of the least diverse disciplines in science. So to get to do that work with folks that are passionate about it, who know a lot about it, has taught me a lot. And I feel very, very grateful to be doing that work.
Yeah, thank you so much. And that's important in terms of representation, but I also want to continue digging into these barriers, as Ms. Margaret, you talked about the need to center the community, and Kirin talked about the overhead, like the amount of money. Anyone feel free to jump in. Like, I think we really need to identify these barriers, because I'm sure there are a lot of people going, I didn't realize that, because it's built into the system, right? It's built into the way that we give access. So any other barriers that you think we need to be mindful of, Ms. Margaret, as we think about what this granting process would look like before we go into some best practice? I really want to dig deep into what these barriers have been and what you've seen from your vantage point.
My point is that the foundation sometimes don't see the value of doing the research, especially community-based research. If you don't have a professor or academia co-leading with you or leading the process, they don't see the value of the expertise and the experiences as a resident. They don't value that. Unless you have to do a protest or something like that, a rally, a demonstration, for them to get the point. Hey, we have our values, we have our expertise. We might not be as on the same academia or academic as the foundation or the grant manager, to see that we have a value here and we bring value to your table. We bring value to your table. And they don't seem to understand how to reimagine that people off the block are people who have committed and have been determined to make these changes in the community are just as equal and as equity as you are. And that, and another thing too, they talk about equity, but don't practice equity. All right? There's a lot of conversation about equity, but they don't even know how to practice it. There's a constant struggle for me to go in these rooms and pinpoint that to our two agencies, regulatory people, academia. Y'all talk about it, but don't know how to practice it. You don't know how to, you don't even know how to put get from A to B about equity, and until we tell you how unequitable you were. So when they start talking about equity, I always ask them, define equity to me as from your experience, but I'm gonna define equity to you as my experience. Because they don't, they just talk about it because to me, it's very popular now, but they don't really truly do not have the heart and soul of what equity is about. Because if they did, we would not be in this place where we are so divided.
Yeah.
Why are we so divided? Because we don't have equity, and somebody got to put it in your face because you did not know. You didn't come to the table in the beginning, understanding, oh wow, that is what real equity is about.
Yeah. How do you practice it?
Yeah, equality and equity is two different things.
Yeah, yeah. Kirin, Susan, those barriers, what comes up for you all? Thank you so much, Ms. Margaret, for that. How we reimagine what's possible in this process. That's why we're here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Ms. Margaret, the need to really center equity and center community needs in grant making and to meet people where they are. We think about this very much with our students. How do we reach the student population that we want to recruit to our discipline? But the same thing could be for community needs for West Oakland or anywhere. I think Kirin might have mentioned this idea that you really need to build programming with the community needs in mind, or you're not going to get the results that you want. And that is, to me, a lot of times a barrier is that funders are kind of at this sort of 50,000-foot view. And how do you meet the local needs and have local impact and the local outcomes you want if there's a mismatch between sort of the funders' view and priorities and the local needs and priorities? And how do you connect those? Are there ways that you can partner more closely with those local communities to make sure that you're reaching the right audience?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on these kind of barriers. I think the one that's standing out to me the most, though, is that especially in the environmental space, the community development space, the planning space, we as funders value technical experts, private consulting firms, research institutions as experts. And what we often undervalue and underfund are community members as experts, right? And I think we all know that, but the question is like, what does that look like in practice, right? We talk about equity as an outcome often, but we don't think about equity as part of the process at every single step. And so things that we're trying to explore, I mentioned overhead and indirect costs, but it's so much more than that, right? It's actually paying residents, not a stipend of $15 to come to your meeting, but pay them a consulting rate to actually inform the outcomes and the products of your work. Because at the end of the day, that plan, that policy, that research is less effective without that resident's voice or without that community organization's voice and input. And then I think the other thing is like we hear, fund childcare and food and public engagement. And I think we are 10 years past that conversation, if I'm being perfectly honest. Those are, that's common human decency, right? We're using your time and we're asking you to take time out of your day to inform our product. Like that shouldn't even be a question, especially for, philanthropic funding and other sorts of funding that is less constrained in nature. What I want to talk about though, actually, is the fact that at a macro scale, the issues that we're facing are often global in nature and about economic systems, which is going to take a lot of work and a lot of funding. And a lot of the funding that philanthropic organizations and even local and state government has is, just kind of biting around the edges, if I'm being perfectly honest. And so the question is, with limited funding, are we really trying to solve these structural issues, or are we investing in the capacity and the sustainability of community organizations and communities to inform that work on a longer period of time, to form the networks, to put in place the planning that they can then leverage larger pots of dollars? And so I think for me, when I've had conversations with funders and philanthropic organizations in California around, how can we support? Don't necessarily fund the outcome, fund the process, fund the community organizations to come together to do the citizen science and planning work that is then going to be, this is going to lead that community to be able to leverage and access larger pots of money. It's the capacity building, it's the sustainability of the work rather than the kind of the one-time outcome. That to me is not sustainable funding for organizations that really need it and that we value in these processes.
I have to jump in and just say how critical those 2 points are from a small organization's perspective. capacity building is huge, the ability to help us help ourselves. And that can be challenging with a really small staff, for us to be able to just even penetrate funders, to understand, to build those relationships, to understand what funders are looking for. And then the sustainability, it takes a lot of, you can't do a citizen science project for a year and just drop it. We can't fund 12 students and then just move on. But I feel like we spend, our volunteers spend an inordinate amount of money or time chasing the money to try to keep these things going. And how do funders build in sustainability into our programming so we can continue this important work?
One of the things that we have perfected as West Oakland Environmental Indicators, you want to sit down at a table with us? You want to talk about a grant with us? Well, you develop a partner agreement with us. And we spell out each other with each other. What is the work? How that's even for an NGO who wants to do a project. We have to have some agreements with you. It's just not you come in and we just back up and let you do what you want to do. No, it doesn't work that way. No, you don't get access to the community without a particular process being formed. No, you do not. We will not go in any meetings with you to meet with any officials, agencies, regulatory people without our specific talking points of being added. No, and no, that's not happening. So one of the things that we have, if we partner with an NGO, we have to be in co-leadership with each other. They do not get to they get to run and rule everything. I have had the experience where an NGO staff wanted to go to the Port of Oakland and meet with them, but they didn't want me to go. And the other staff person told me about it, and I had to just come out. You don't have a relationship with those people. I do. I'm a former member. I'm a former board member. What you think they gonna look like when you go and say you work with EIP, West Oakland Environmental Indicators, and I'm not sitting there? You're gonna look stupid. The woman got real red-faced and had to apologize that she really did not understand. And that was one of the first time that somebody had told her from the community, you don't get to lead what the work that I have been doing. That is not your job. And furthermore, you need to ask me yourself. Not send somebody else to ask me, you ask me some questions. So it's also a thing about race, sex, and gender, how some of the others who come into our community still at this time and place still have not put in their consciousness. You are not the only one here. You don't get to run everything. And if you can't come in with a balanced understanding, don't come, because you're a problem. You're a problem. And I don't need the added stress of trying to reorientating your thinking to be in my community. That's a waste of my time. If you really want to do something, you come with the checkbook. So hey, I want to see your tutelage, Miss Margaret, so I can understand where is this coming from? Where are you coming from? Yeah. That's more important. And then we can finally build some trust and some relationships. But other than that, don't just think that just this is la-la land. No, this is not a la-la land process here.
Yeah. Thank you, Ms. Margaret. Lots of wonderful things that you all shared in terms of best practices and ways to really engage in the community. I see people have started to put their questions in. That's great. I'm gonna share some questions with the panel and folks just kind of jump in where you see fit. We have a question from Josh. How can a large, well-resourced NGO best help small partner organizations that would like to access larger grant opportunities? How can a large, well-resourced NGO best help small partner organizations that would like to access larger grant opportunities?
If nobody else want to answer that, I will. You come in asking the question, what can we do? How can we work together? What is your self-interest and what is our self-interest? We start, and how do we remedy these past inconsistencies that has made us be apart? Let's be really, let's really be put our big girl underwear on and big boy underwear on to address the real issues that have made communities be disadvantaged, underserved, and bring the, not just be in the mode to survive, but also for thriving. That's my thought of how those big groups can come to my table. Because I want to set the table just like they want to set the table. And not only just not be on somebody else's menu, but be at the head of the table with you. If you come with that kind of mindset, we can make work with something. But if we don't have that mindset, I got to spend time talking to you about how to come to this table. I should be paid for that too.
Oh, go ahead, Kirin.
Oh, thank you. I just have two quick thoughts on this. The first thought I had was often the pathway to larger dollar amounts is being able to prove that you've implemented a smaller grant, right? And so it's a foot in the door kind of problem. And one way that kind of medium-sized and larger-sized nonprofit organizations can support their networks is by actually partnering, subgranting, and subcontracting with some of those smaller organizations, those 1 or 2 people organizations, so that they can start building up a track record. As frustrating as it is, federal funders, state funders like to see a track record of having, received and implemented those pots of funding. And then the other thing that I think is really important is widening your network. I think in the environmental space, we have a tendency of continuing to work with the same organizations with environmental related missions. But I think that one of the most important things for me is that, organizations that are working on labor issues, education reform and education access, healthcare access, may not be experts on, estuary restoration, sea level rise, urban planning, but they are experts on the impacts that their communities and their neighbors are facing. And I think having them part of your process is not just opening them and making accessible more funding to the work that they're doing or they could be doing. It's also really informing your projects and your process to be actually respective and responsive to the issues that are happening in communities. So yeah, I think I'll stop there.
I think for me, one of the challenges with collaborative work like that is one, building those authentic relationships and building that trust. I think that's where Ms. Margaret was going, to make sure everybody's aware of what everybody's role is and what you want to get out of it and why we're coming to the table together. And then for me, this coming from a very small organization, the second thing is anything that you can do to provide additional capacity for us is helpful. Like implementing any program like this takes a lot of staff work, and a lot of times it can be stuff that we don't have the capacity for, that volunteers are doing, that really somebody that can help like coordinate some of the stuff, like just grant management, the financial side. We don't really have a lot of that capacity. Helping us with organizing reports, because reporting requirements can be really challenging. So if you can bring that knowledge and time to a project like that, to me seems like a really valuable resource for a more well-resourced organization to be able to help a smaller one.
Great, thank you all. Our next question is, as a state government, our funding typically needs to adhere to legislated requirements for the way it's spent. There are a lot of things we cannot pay for, even if we wanted to. There's also a pressure to prove to the public that their taxes were spent responsibly. Everyone wants metrics and quantifiable outputs. The impact of quality community engagement or DEIJ efforts cannot be easily be quantified or is undermined by focusing on metrics rather than outcomes. How can we support these kinds of broad and meaningful initiatives when we're working within such a rigid framework? Kirin, I'm going to go to you because I see you shaking nodding your head on that. So how can we support these kinds of broad and meaningful initiatives when we're working within such a rigid framework?
It's really tough. And I have the privilege of working within an administration that is really prioritizing this. Governor Gavin Newsom talks about a California for All agenda, which kind of drives a lot of the thinking around how we set these expectations. But at the same time, I think there's work that's happening across the country that we can kind of look to as an example. I'm struck by I believe it's Van Jones's organization around common ground. And I think one thing that links communities wherever they are on the political spectrum is the idea of locally determined solutions. And so, you know, unfortunately, in some communities, we may not be calling it DEIJ, but we're talking about, you know, shifting power to community to self-determined solutions, I think is an incredibly important way of talking about and setting expectations around what we'll fund. More specifically, I think slowly but steadily building metrics within your funding programs around this. If you, I mean, I know folks are asking for more quantifiable outcomes, but I think if you as funders, we are setting you know, metrics around populations engaged, community organizations that are partnering on these, community organizations that we're funding to do this work, to the degree possible, BIPOC communities that are involved in our projects, especially within planning and research. I think it helps move this in that direction. And then I think the other important piece is that I think there's more flexibility naturally in planning funding, research funding, and non-infrastructure funding. Kind of community visioning to set expectations around kind of process that we've talked about today. And then I think the last part is to not always think about us as having to fund the work, but actually using our funding to incentivize that work. And so setting expectations, and this is something that we've done at the California Strategic Growth Council with some of our funding, is setting an expectation that we'll only fund projects that can demonstrate that the outcomes that we are looking to build or do can be traced back to citizen science, community-led planning, community charrettes and visioning work, right? So we don't necessarily have to fund that work if that's too difficult with our constrained funding, but we are setting a signal to those local governments, to those philanthropic partners, to those organizations that to access and unlock some of our more constrained state funding to maybe build these projects, you need to draw a connection back to process that really centers diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion.
My issue is that who's sitting at the table to write these metrics? Because all metrics don't mean all things to all people. I would like to see a metric where is that a mother is not spending sitting up all night like with a child having an asthma attack, or she had to get up in the middle of the night, take this child to the emergency hospital or whatever. Why we don't have those type of metrics? It's going to be a cost one way or the other, but why we don't have metrics that's based on the conditions of people, the people who are impacted and vulnerable? Those metrics are never written in such a way that it really looks at the who needs what. And yes, I'm not sitting at the table with that individual who's writing these metrics. Why is that metrics based in and measurements based in the issue that's most concerning to a community? It's never that. It's something so removed from day-to-day life of how people have to survive through these impacts and vulnerabilities. And we need to have metrics that support that. That's one of the things I would like to see before I leave this earth, that we have people have developed metrics based on real life issues. Real life issues.
So we've been really fortunate to receive funding to do expert evaluation of our programming in this last round. And I just think that is so incredibly helpful and useful. I encourage funders to find a way to make that happen, so that you can, I can count widgets, right? Number of students that we supported, whatever, but to actually get somebody to dig in, to interview the students, to do surveys, to understand their experience, and think more about like outcomes than outputs. We need to be able to share our success stories. It helps us to gain more, as a rationale for additional funding. It shows that the DEIJ efforts that we're doing are making a difference. And so I think we should. I think we need to absolutely pick the right metrics, but if we have support to measure, I think that's only a good thing for us to be able to say, yes, we've received the funding and we are doing what we said we wanted to do and we are making a difference. But yeah, I mean, I don't have the capacity to do that myself. I don't have the expertise or capacity. So being able to find the funding to do that work is important.
Great. Well, we are at time, my friends, and I just wanted to thank you all for your expertise. Thank you all for your passion. Thank you all for the work that you do. Thank you all for helping us to think about ways that we can do our work differently. You do all do it so eloquently. So I'm going to give you maybe 30 seconds or any final thoughts that you want to share before we close it out. Susan?
I guess I want to start with the positive. I am incredibly encouraged by the support that this field has been getting in recent years. There are funding opportunities. There's a recognition that this is important work. I am optimistic, and I'm really hoping that this helps broaden the opportunities for small organizations like mine.
Kirin.
I think I keep coming back to what we talked about at the top of this panel, which is if we are not doing this work to address the disproportionate health outcomes that we are seeing because of the actions of institutions, then what are we doing this work for really? And what are we using our power as funders, as government, as research institutions for? And so for me, that's been a call to action in my career, and I hope it increasingly feels like one for all of you.
I am hopeful if those who are put this together continue to put things like this together so that you can hear from those who've been in the trenches and having firsthand experiences to give testimony to what the work they had to do to overcome, continuously overcome to push the envelope. And I think these type of events have to be continued, have to be a continuous process, proceedings for growth inside inside and outside of such organizations that we've been talking about. And if we don't have the space in place for this, we would be back at the challenging process where we should not be challenging people's ability to not to be impacted and not to be vulnerable.
Yeah. And at this point, we're all accountable because we spent time with you. We've heard your stories and we know what we need to do on our end. So we thank you all so much for your, again, for your time and your wonderful advice. And this comment in the chat, I think, sums up some of the things that we're trying to get at today. Someone shared, in the environmental space, anytime we propose research or monitoring, it usually comes with the requirement to create a hefty quality assurance program plan. I get the purpose of this, but there should be an exemption or lessening of this requirement for community-based participatory research projects that receive federal funding from the EPA. That's 100% barrier for the small orgs and groups. Perhaps that's the role for foundations, funding more of that community research without those prohibitive requirements. I think that really sums up what we're trying to do, is to expand what's possible in terms of growth, in terms of funding, in terms of health. You know, I'll never forget that, Ms. Margaret, in terms of adding people's health to this equation. So as we wrap up today, Brianna, I don't know if we're going to bring up our next slide. Just want to again thank you all for being here. And this is an ongoing conversation. We have several more workshops scheduled over the course of the next couple months or the rest of this year, and thinking about how do we share out those best practices. Today was Inclusive Coast Initiatives, Improving Equity and Grant Making. We'll continue with Inclusion Coast Initiatives, Rethinking Your Application Process. So how to put some of those things and remove some of those barriers we identified. And then partners, communities, and program design. Again, like, how do we center those community voices? As Ms. Margaret said, what are the agreements that we're willing to make with people who are on the ground doing the work every day? Next slide, please. I just want to say, you know, this was just something that was on paper maybe a little over a year and a half ago. And I really want to give just amazing shout out to Brianna, who is behind the scenes, who worked so hard to put this together, to reach out to everyone, to make sure that you all had what you needed today in such a thoughtful way. So Brianna, all praise go to you, my friend. You did an amazing job. And to everyone who's here, Ms. Margaret, Kirin, Susan, everyone, all the words of advice that we heard, let's all take one thing, right? One thing that we heard today, go back to our organizations and commit to doing that. And we'd love to hear back from you. We're here, we have another webinar. We're presenting the same webinar later today if people want to come back. But we also thank you so much for your time and your ongoing support. And we look forward to continuing this conversation with you. Everyone have a great day and stay safe and healthy.